not to have Julia, who's going to be discussing the potential repercussions. Have fun.
One of my main aspects of why I decided to write con is a specific example that happened in 2000 where Bush and Al Gore were running against each other, Democratic and Republican, and what happened with the third-party vote is that the third-party candidate was Ralph Nader, and he was also very popular, but obviously not popular enough to become president. But essentially, he in Florida, when they're narrowing it down to the last state, he got some of those votes and essentially took them away from Al Gore because his and Al Gore's policies are very similar. So people that liked Ralph Nader voted for Ralph Nader instead of Al Gore, and that took votes away from Al Gore and led Bush to win that state, and he ended up winning the state overall. And if those people would have just voted for Al Gore, they would have ended up with someone with more similar policies than Bush did, as opposed to voting for the third party, and that ended up being a negative thing for them in the end. And what's interesting is that they interviewed those people after, and they said they would have voted for Al Gore over President Bush because they thought that the policies were similar, and they kind of regret voting for Nader in the end.
That is one of the main criticisms. Like, when I was writing this story as well, people say, like, splitting the ticket can be a really big negative, and basically, like you said, just not voting for, or voting for a third candidate is basically voting for the opponent who you do not want to win. But at the same time, you really just because that fear, you disregarding those opinions, though, is still just disregarding, like, really pivotal things that could play a big part in our future. That's not necessarily true that it completely hurts the other party, because all these third parties, the major candidates need their votes, and so a lot of times these smaller third parties' policies, they'll be adopted by the major parties just because they do need those votes. And so if you aren't voting for the third parties, the major parties won't ever look at them, and those policies won't get anywhere. But by voting for them, you're showing them, oh, okay, maybe we need to step up and actually adopt these policies.
And I agree that the third party voting for a third party does make a political statement, but I also believe that it really depends on who the two main parties are, Democratic and Republican, because that's who we mainly vote for. And looking at those two people, if, as a voter, this is kind of what I would do if I were voting, I would look at those two candidates and think, would I be okay with either one of them ending up in the Oval Office? And if that's the case, then I think it is an appropriate time to vote for the third party, because it's fine to take that risk, and ending up with either of those candidates doesn't necessarily hurt. So that's when you take the risk, and then eventually in elections later on in years future, you may end up with a third party having more popularity, and that's good. But in certain elections, and I think specifically this one, because there's a lot of people that really dislike certain candidates on either side, and they really would prefer one to be in office as opposed to the other, and it kind of depends on which one you think. But I think specifically in this election, it's kind of taking a risk, because letting one of those candidates be in office, no matter which one you favor, is a risk. And if you think that personally yourself, you should be voting for one of them as opposed to a third party, because the one that you end up wanting in office could be the actual opposite. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, definitely. I was talking to actually Miss Edward about this, and we were talking about this current election and how there is like a even higher level of dissatisfaction with both of the candidates than there really ever has been. And because of that, a lot of millennials, in my story, I found that a full 50% of millennials now describe themselves as politically independent, and they don't necessarily want to take the risk of choosing one over the other, like you said. And the third party does give them another option. Like, even though they probably, historically, they don't win right now, but there's a greater chance as ever that they'll have more influence now by voting for them, since there are so many moderates today.
I agree.
So another advantage with the third party votes and what makes them so valuable is that, like I said, historically they usually don't win, and they know that, and because of that, the issues they choose to address, they aren't necessarily the popular opinions and the most widely known, and they instead choose to focus on more specific and maybe more controversial views that really they are the only ones who can address, because major parties are so set on more mainstream issues and things like that.
And you're probably right. I think that's probably one of the reasons why they haven't been elected is because they're willing to think outside the box and not just do things to get votes. But then again, for me, it's still weighing your pros and cons and saying, am I willing to take this risk for this election, or should I wait to make a political statement for elections that aren't as risky? And for me, for this election, I would definitely be voting for a major candidate because I think that there's a risk in voting otherwise, depending on whatever candidate you are voting for. And I really do hope, like, it would be very interesting to see a third-party candidate actually be up there in the future.
Definitely.
But I think as of right now, it's just not where we are, and we need to make more realistic and educated decisions off of what we have.
Well, also, I think we also just need to keep in mind, though, all the issues that third parties do bring to the table as well.
Very true.
Oh, cool.
Okay, cool.
So third-party votes,
Are they good?
are they bad?
Either way, it's debatable.